Hello, how's it going, SOBs? Wow, I'm so glad that you are watching this video and that you can join us today for what I think is going to be. I'm just so excited to have this conversation because it's really cool when you get to have your favorite show, the hosts of your favorite show, on your own show. I'm a gigantic fan of the podcast these two guys run, and it's just a thrill to have them with me today. Before we get into all that, we just want to remind you, please join our Facebook group. We have a Facebook group, Stream of Blood. Please go on Twitter and follow at _ Stream of Blood _ and we'll let you know when we're doing cool interviews like this. Also, pickup games of all kinds of different things. And remember, we have our 2 regular series running all the time every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Pacific. Vampires of Pittsburgh, a Vampire the Masquerade Chronicle starring Thomas Middleditch, Ashley Birch, and Ross Bryant. That's still happening. And then every Sunday, we have a Call of Cthulhu game with a rotating cast, the Neptune Society, every Sunday at 2 p.m. Pacific. So please watch those shows, but also follow the Facebook group and the Twitter stream so you know when we're doing extra cool stuff like this. So let's get right into it. Today, here in the Stream of Blood Laboratory, I have 2 guys. I am a die-hard fan of their podcast. It's the Appendix N Book Club podcast. For my money, these guys are the most erudite ambassadors of gaming and literature I've ever had the privilege to come across. And here they are now to have a talk with me about adapting literature to gaming. Please welcome Jeff Goad and Hoy, the hosts of the Appendix N Book Club podcast. Hey guys, how's it going?
Hi, Jared, great to be here.
Yeah, hey, thanks for having us on the show.
Well, I'm thrilled I get to talk to you guys. It's that weird thing where you listen to a podcast a long time and then you just feel like you know the guys who host it, because I probably have listened to over 100 hours of you guys talking, and I really appreciate your take. You guys know how to review a book, talk about a book, and you understand tabletop gaming. So those are the 2 things I love. I know a lot of my viewers love. Just to get started, in case any of my viewers or followers don't know, what is the Appendix N Book Club podcast? Could you tell them a little about it?
But then he looped me in. I'm a member of the cult.
Sure. So the Appendix N Book Club podcast is a podcast where we are discussing the Appendix N. And the Appendix N is one of the appendices in the back of the 1979 Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. And it is the list of the books, fictional series, and authors that are recommended by the co-creator of Dungeons & Dragons, Gary Gygax, that he recommends that you read for inspiration, and that he took as inspiration in the designing of the game. And in the Appendix N Book Club, this started out as an in-person book club. I had started a Dungeon Crawl Classics meetup group in New York. And a big core component to Dungeon Crawl Classics is going back to that original literature and deriving inspiration from that, rather than kind of deriving inspiration from things that were inspired by things that were inspired by things that were inspired by early D&D modules. Like it becomes very... what is the word I'm looking for? Very recursive.
Yeah, self-referential. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was an in-person book club, and Hoy started coming to all of them. And after a while, Hoy was like, we should do something with this. Like, we should write a book or make a podcast or do a zine or something. And I was already on Spellburn, and so I had the equipment and I had the technology, and I was like, sure, let's do this.
Yeah, and it's great. It's great to hear. It's great to learn about the origins of Dungeons and Dragons through the inspirations, the books and stories that inspired it. But it's also great just to hear you guys talk about books. You seem like you are hardcore readers.
Hoy, do you want to take that?
Yeah. Well, if you put a cereal box in front of me, I'll start reading it. It's just like I can't stop reading stuff, but. It's really good to go back to the stuff. Sometimes you forget how much like layers and strata develop over stuff, and it's good to kind of get down to the base level or the bare metal or whatever mixed metaphor you want to use. And some of it is great, some of it is not so great, but it has a sort of purity is not the right word I'm looking for, but a sort of freedom, right?
There is, yeah. There's a freewheeling quality to those old books that I don't know. Sometimes the newer stuff is a little bit more. Well, like you said, Jeff, the formula is there, and it's a copy of the formula of the formula. But some of those older books, they were kind of just making up. They were making up the genre of fantasy for the first time. So.
Right.
Absolutely. And a lot of this stuff is coming from an era where there was no clear division between fantasy, science fiction, and horror. All three of these were just weird fiction. That's what the genre was in like the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. But now that we're in 2020, we have very hard and fast lines as in this is horror, this is thriller, this is science fiction, this is fantasy. But prior to that, to the kind of modern era, we didn't really have that clear division.
Right.
I don't think people know that either. I think that people think that it's always been, like these really stratified lines. I think you guys have said on the podcast that bookstores kind of made up, right?
I think that, and I think to a certain extent that, again, it's recursive because once you're told something is fantasy or science fiction, then that picture forms in your mind, and then when you see something that's not that exactly, right? Then it's suddenly like, oh, well, but that's not fantasy. It's like, but no, it is. Star Wars is clearly fantasy, right?
Yeah.
It's really more fantasy than science fiction.
And it's marketing too. It's like the Lord of the Rings becomes this huge cultural phenomenon in the 1960s, and people who are marketing books are like, how can we get people who love the Lord of the Rings to buy these books? So they kind of start putting on that stamp of fantasy on it.
Right.
I think
they're like, you know what worked in this? Right. Elves in a bucolic setting, and they didn't realize that it was so many things beyond that. They could only identify those signifiers. Yeah.
Right. And I think in particular, sort of like the big bookstores like Barnes and Noble or something like that, where when you were going to your drugstore or something like that with a spinner rack, it was really just about the covers grabbing you, right? But now, at a big bookstore, a lot of stuff is spine out, not cover out. Right, it's sort of like the where you have to pay for the end cap to get your cereal on the end cap, right? So if you're in Barnes and Noble, like, well, where do I go? I go over to the frozen food aisle. That's where you'll find Conan, right?
You guys ask this on every episode of your show, but I want to know, and you might have even covered it on your show, but it's been episodes ago. How did you first become aware of the Appendix N, and how did you get into tabletop RPGs?
Jeff, you want to take that one first?
Sure, I'll go first. So I was 10 years old, and I was living on naval housing, and I was in the unit above my friend Josh, and we had a neighbor a few doors down who was I believe in his late 20s, and he was running Dungeons and Dragons games for his friends, and he invited me and my friend Josh to go play with him. And we played 2 sessions, I believe, before he was arrested for molesting little boys in the neighborhood. And it turns out maybe that's why he had invited us to join, was he was potentially grooming us. So
have you talked about this on your show?
I don't think I have.
I get the scoop.
So that's pretty freaky.
Yeah, that is freaky.
That said, Josh and I had so much fun in those 2 sessions that my mom went out and bought me the D&D books. And because we didn't have anybody else to play with, I just started running the games for my friend Josh. This is when I'm 10. I'm playing D&D through the age of 12, at which point I decide I'm way too cool for Dungeons and Dragons. I start smoking cigarettes and dye my hair black and start playing Vampire the Masquerade because it's 1992. And then when I'm 14, I give up RPGs altogether because I'm just way too cool for RPGs. But then when I was 18, 3rd edition came out, and I've just been playing consistently since I was 18.
Wild. Okay.
Just prove that Jack Chick was right. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Jack Chick was right, and the game is so fun that even if you almost get molested, you still want to play more.
Exactly. And then in terms of how I came across the Appendix N, I started gaming with the 2nd edition era in 1990 when 2nd edition was brand new. So I did not at that point have the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide. So I didn't really become aware of it until I entered the 4th edition era, really despised that system, and went and kind of joined the whole OSR movement. They became very interested in exploring the roots of Dungeons and Dragons. And at that point, I became aware of it as a concept. I had read almost nothing of it.
Yeah.
And then when I got into Dungeon Crawl Classics, and especially once I got on the podcast Spellburn and was a regular co-host on that show, it became apparent to me that I really had a strong desire to go back and start reading these things, because I had read almost none of it except like the Lord of the Rings and a few Conan stories.
Right. How about you, Hoy? What was your how did you end up in this corner of fandom?
Somewhere in third grade, the Holmes blue box started showing up, and a couple of my friends had it. And I don't even remember if we actually ever played, but I just remember seeing a couple people having it. And at that time, I didn't have a lot of books or toys. I was just going to the library a lot, but I was like, it was so cool, right? And I was already into like the Hobbit cartoon back then, and I'd read the Hobbit and the Narnia books. There again around third grade. I'm not sure if I even read the Hobbit cover to cover or had it read to me, but I definitely read the Narnia books. And at that point, my parents were very poor graduate students, but somehow they found the $10 to buy the Holmes blue box, and it was the set when they ran out of dice, and so you had the chits that you had to cut out, and so I don't remember when I actually even got dice.
Wow.
So, and then there were some of the original brown book, little brown books were still floating around, so we weren't really sure how it fit in. And then I think the subsequent year, my dad got a publishing contract with Random House, who were at that point distributing TSR stuff to the trade. And so he went down to New York to meet his editor and had a long meeting with his editor. And the editor, we were waiting outside, like my sister and I, just sitting out in the waiting room. And then the editor calls us in. He goes, "Hey, do you want to, have you heard of Dungeons and Dragons?" And he gave us he gave me like the 3 original hardcovers, right? Which I have somewhere. I don't know where they are now. And so, yeah, and at that point, it was like straight from Holmes into AD&D. So all the stuff that people really prize in the OSR, like BX and BECME, like I wasn't even aware of those until later on. I was already moving on to other games when those came along. Appendix N, I must have come across, but I don't believe that I actually ever had that list in front of me to like go down the line. I think it was more the Deities and Demigods book that introduced me to the fiction that was later in Appendix N, like all the Michael Moorcock books, the Fafford and Gray Mouser books.
Yeah.
It had great librarians. I grew up in the Boston area, and that's every town there has a great library. And so there's generally pretty good fantasy sections there. There's a lot of colleges there. There was a couple of specialized science fiction bookstores. So, on and on. And then going back to Appendix N as a thing, I mean, I can remember hearing about it, but going back to it as a thing probably slightly predates my getting back into gaming. I never sort of stopped buying gaming books, but there was a long fallow period of like maybe 15 years where I wasn't really actively gaming. We all have those periods.
Sure.
And so I think it was around tied in with all the OSR. Lamentations of the Flame Princess, Grognardia blog, etc. And actually, I came to DCC relatively late, because the thing that sort of most caught me interested in the OSR was probably Lamentations of the Flame Princess. And I was like, oh, what's this DCC? It seems a little kind of like, I don't know, and the hipster's not the right word, because Lamentations is clearly more hipster, but it seems kind of a little bit,
right.
Big Daddy
DIY.
Roth. DIY, Big Daddy Roth, funny car version of D&D, right? So, right.
Well, let's talk about it a little bit, because on my stream, we run like a vampire game with the new 5th edition. We run Call of Cthulhu, one of my favorite games. But I am a huge proponent of the OSR movement and of Dungeon Crawl Classics, which is one of the mini games that you can play that are kind of created, designed in that OSR style, that old school Renaissance style. So if any viewers don't know, it basically means that the rules and the style of the game are kind of based a little bit more on those old school Dungeons and Dragons experiences, those blue box experiences, those BECME. There are all these like weird, very specific terms that some people might not know, but like basic D&D, expert, BX, right?
Right. It's like slicing all the flavors of punk or heavy metal, right? That's what.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, oh, that's not stoner metal. That's doom metal.
Yeah,
like, okay,
totally. No, I do love all the different little flavors and having those conversations about like, well, actually, I prefer this specific type of metal. Right. But the OSR, like, what's the appeal of the OSR? Like, why, there might be some people watching who are like, aren't the newer rules better? Or why do you want to play with old rules? So I'll let you guys kind of answer that.
For me, it was I sort of missed a lot of the in between, so it's just immediately familiar. I mean, I was I think you guys play Gurps on your channel. I played Gurps, and I know Thomas Middleditch is a huge Gurps fan.
Oh yeah,
Call of Cthulhu. I played all of those, but so in some ways, I'm not even sure that D&D is my favorite game. It's just the one that brought me into gaming.
Sure.
But so I missed like the whole 3rd edition era, the 4th edition era. 5th edition looked very appealing initially, but I was already sort of like Lamentations is very much in my wheelhouse because I love Call of Cthulhu so much. It's like, oh, D&D, but like Call of Cthulhu. Okay, that's two great tastes that go great together. So
Sure.
And realizing now, as I've we all have lives, that I have less overhead to sort of process new rule sets and new ways
Sure.
of like getting very granular, and so I think there's a certain freedom. I mean, AD&D, which is today's 1st edition D&D, is very particular, but I think most people didn't really play it as written anyway. I'm sure I'll get some arguments about that, but I'm sure that a lot of people, at least if they started at my age and weren't adults by the time they started playing, probably didn't absorb all that stuff. So
we all sort of, when we started table, kind of made up the rules.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so anything that, I mean, I don't like stuff that's super freeform because I do still need to have some kind of grounding. But anything that sort of gets in the way of just getting to the table and playing, and to me it seems like some of the newer rule sets have a lot of mental overhead that you have to.
Yeah, some of the new rule sets, there's a lot of rules. I'd say rule sets from the 90s forward. There's a lot of stuff in there. You mentioned Gurps. I mean, Gurps is sometimes it's mind-boggling how many different optional rules, on cover and angle of your shot and hit locations and on and on and on.
Which tends to obscure the actual elegance of that system, which is incredibly elegant, but it has all these sort of like knobs and dials.
As it's at its base level, it's incredibly elegant. Yeah, but you can put a lot of ornaments on that tree. What about you, Jeff? You like to run DCC, play DCC. Like, what do you love about the OSR?
Yeah, so for me, it's more about the modern take on the old school rules that I really love. One of the things that used to really frustrate me back when I was playing 3rd edition and then Pathfinder and then went to 4th edition was this whole idea that like there was a right way to play the game. And if there was a situation you didn't know how to handle, you would turn to page 271 and you would stop the game and everybody would be reading these like multiple paragraphs on how many rounds you can be submerged in water before you start need to be making constitution saves or whatever.
Right.
And we just became so mired in the what is the word I'm looking for? When you're trying to the simulationism of RPGs, and I don't know. I got to a point where I got really burnt out on that.
Yeah.
And one of the real beauties of a lot of OSR games, and not all OSR games are rules light. Like you look at something like Hackmaster, and Hackmaster is crunchier than anything from the 3rd edition era, and that's still absolutely 100% an OSR game. But for me, the Hackmaster side of the OSR isn't the part that I'm drawn to. It's the Dungeon Crawl Classics, it's Black Hack, it's Maze Rats, things like that, where the emphasis really is on fast and loose, DM fiat, just making calls on the go. If you aren't quite sure how a rule works, make it up, and if we want to revisit it after the session is over, we can do that, but we don't have to. Also, one of the things that I love about playing Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy role-playing games is that is the collaborative storytelling element of it. And one of the things that I love about the OSR is because so much of it is built on kind of this frame of old school D&D. You have all of this, like this wealth of material that's being put out by publishing companies, by bloggers, by people who are just writing zines. and almost all of it is compatible with each other. So
Yeah.
it brings in that kind of collaborative, the part that I love at the table, the collaborative storytelling element, that also happens when it comes to the materials that are available for us to play with.
Yeah, and a lot of it's free, like you mentioned, blogs. Like, so, these guys put out all these incredible ideas and like ways to play and things to play with in your game, and a lot of it's free. And I really do like that DIY kind of aspect to it, where it's punk rock. It's kind of like you don't really need a bunch of expensive game books to do this. You can kind of do this with a PDF off the internet that cost you $5 and then your imagination.
Sure.
Hey,
But
there's a
also,
There's a lot of
if you,
fetishizing of expensive toys.
but also, if you want expensive books in the OSR, those are absolutely there too.
Right,
Like the
those-
Swordfish Islands books are very pricey, but they are
Right.
gorgeous artifacts that are beautifully designed.
Right,
Yeah,
or the
yeah.
DCC special edition, like leather-bound covers or whatever. And to be
Yeah.
fair, like 5th edition, you could play without ever buying a 5th edition D&D book by just downloading the SRD. and
Yeah,
playing with
that's
that.
true. Yeah.
So. And,
So
you
fifth
know,
edition's free too now, y'all.
Right. So get out there. It is interesting because there's sort of I guess we could get into a long discussion about how OSR can be kind of a loaded term, but there is sort of an artificial division between sort of the indie game scene and the OSR scene because they're all at their base about creativity, but sort of sometimes coming at it from different angles, right? So sometimes some people will privilege sort of that collaborative storytelling more. Some people want to treat it, or really prize the game element of it, right? Which the literal game, capital G element of it. If you ever play like back-to-back games with me and Jeff, Jeff is incredible master of pace, just moving along, just taking whatever you throw at him, and it's like, okay, I like it, let's do this, right? I'm a little bit more like, okay, well, this is the world as it exists. You can mess around with anything you want, but I'm telling you right now, it's 110 degrees in the shade, and there's nothing you can do about that, right? How you want to adapt to that, that's your business. But that's
Yeah.
if you're a 10th level wizard that has weather control spells of some sort, it's 110 in the shade, right?
Yeah.
And that's sort of
Yeah, well, that balance of, this is the objective reality of my world, and then this is me improvising off of what you're giving me. I mean, that's all what makes all the different GMs, the different game masters different, and it also it really affects, what kind of play experience you're getting. But I kind of like a little of both. I like a little of both, personally.
And I think it is important to, that's, for me, that's why I have a little bit of a harder time, and I really need to just get in with really good players and game masters to the games that are sort of very, and this is, I guess, the topic of the show, the ones that are sort of very much emulating a story structure or fiction, fiction.
But I sometimes that's not my jam either. Like it's odd. It's like I really like improvising in my games. I like it if a game master improvises if I'm playing, or as a game master, I like to really have it be open-ended. But when I play a game like, and these are fantastic games, by the way. I think these are the highest level of quality you can get in a game. But like a game like Dungeon World or a Blades in the Dark, where the game is sort of more emulating a narrative style than old school D&D, which I guess is kind of more saying, here's a location and things are kind of objectively in these locations and this is the way the physics work. For some reason, I like that. I like that kind of objective world a little bit. And when it's like more emulating a narrative style, I don't know. It's like sometimes it has to do with your age too, right? Like, I feel like because I was raised on a certain type of game, some of those different story type games, I'm like kind of like, wait a second, am I gonna enjoy this? Can I get into this?
Yeah, no. And for my case, I'm certainly a little bit more reserved. I don't have any sort of. Right now I see a lot of. When I was playing when I was a kid, I didn't see a lot of theater kids playing. Right now, there's a ton of theater kids.
Sure,
playing,
yeah.
And people who are very versed in improv and theater games and, short like flash fiction and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
Like that. And so you didn't really have those outlets as much in like the late 70s, early 80s as much. And I think it's having those being versed in that is has changed how the games get played. Not like it's not quantumly different. It's just an emphasis.
It's an emphasis change. Also, I think that everybody has preferences. I have them, you have them, but I think that if it's a great group and a great game master, you're just gonna. I mean, I'll love it. It doesn't really. It could be bunnies and burrows or whatever game you want to play.
100%. I played a 4th edition campaign. I ran a 4th edition campaign for 2 years, and we had a blast. We almost all hated the system. There were 2 players who were pretty into the system, but the rest of us and I as the game master were not into the system. But we still had a fantastic time. So yes, you can have fun with any game with the right players and judge, but also you can have way more fun if you also have the game that's suited to the style of play you're looking for.
Right.
It's funny that you mentioned that, though, because 4th edition is having a little bit of a revival in sort of like the DIY and indie game scene.
Really?
Like if you sort of follow,
this is news to me.
I'm shocked.
Follow some game designer Twitter. There's some people like, hey, it's really time to sort of like look at 4th edition again. FM Geist, who was on our show, is a fan of 4th edition.
But she talks about how 4th edition is great as like a tactics game, like not as a role-playing game, but like if you want to sit down and
the fact that it was branded as Dungeons and Dragons was probably the problem. It's probably an amazing game if it wasn't Dungeons and Dragons. It's probably the
Yeah, I mean, I played 2 years of it too. I dungeon mastered it for 2 years too. I got people to 13th level. God, so we played a lot of it, but for me it was like a lot of drawing maps and setting things up, and I was like, oh man, I don't need a part-time job. I want a hobby, not a
And I know this will blow some people's minds, but I don't use battle mats. I don't use minis. When I'm gaming, literally all we have is pencils, paper, and dice. And
yeah.
And having been in Jeff's games, he will actually not even have the module in front of him. He'll actually have just written down things on index cards from the module, and he'll just have a of index cards that he's ripping through. So.
Oh, I mean, I think that's great, and I would highly recommend anybody who's listening who's running games read a campaign and then throw the book away and just try to remember it. I think that's so cool, because you're going to add all kinds of cool, interesting stuff.
Absolutely, and especially you're gonna do it by listening to your players too. Your players give you so much great stuff. Like I remember when I was running a 5th edition campaign for a second before I gave up on 5th edition and went hardcore into DCC. But there was a mystery in the town, and they were trying to figure out who had committed this murder. And all of my players had figured out who had committed the murder. The funny thing, though, is it wasn't who I had originally planned to be the murderer, but they had all figured it out, were convinced they were right, and they loved it. And they were like, oh my God, Jeff, that was so brilliant. I can't believe he was the killer. So whatever, I just rolled with it. And they thought I had done this brilliant thing. And really, I just said yes to the thing that they were the path they were already following.
Yeah, that's a great moment. And, it took a lot of wisdom for you to go, oh, okay, yeah, it's that guy now.
Exactly. And I didn't ruin it by saying, oh, well, okay, sure. No, I just said, absolutely, great job, guys. You caught him.
Right.
Yeah, you're there to have fun, and a good story is a good story. Sometimes the players will write it instead of the game master.
And that's a big temptation, especially in investigative games, is to tell them later on what the clues they've missed. But I've just come to this realization now that I will never tell them anything that they missed. Whatever they came up with in the games, if they missed the fact that there was another demon in the room and it was going to end the world, or that the world is going to end anyway, nope, you'll never know what was it. You
totally.
Go buy the module.
Even if it's a one shot, I'm just
right.
That's
what was
great.
really going on.
I need to start doing that, because after I finish games on the stream, people ask questions. They'll be like, what was in that door? And I'll be like, well, all right, I'll tell you. I should really just.
The nature of being on the stream too is a little bit, also sort of giving.
Sure. Well, no, I love people interacting with us, but yeah, there is. You do want to maintain a sense of mystery. I want to move on to the Appendix N a little bit, because we are going to talk about how you make literature into games. Because that's a big thing that we do in the Neptune Society. Is every episode is it's based on a novel or a short story or something like that. So first of all, let's just talk about the Appendix N. I'm in love with a lot of these writers: Edgar Rice Burroughs, Michael Moorcock, Poul Anderson, Roger Zelazny, Fritz Lieber. Why are these guys? What's the enduring appeal here of these writers? and their books beyond the connection to Gygax and D&D and all that. What do you think is so great about these writers and that generation of sci-fi fantasy?
I think that sort of what we alluded to at the beginning of the show. I mean, it's not to say that they weren't building off of, because many of them were also fans of previous writers. You know, Robert D. Howard is a big fan of Harold Lamb, who was writing sort of more historical adventures. So it's not that they were sui generis, right, and jumped up out of nothing, but that they were working. It seems like maybe, you know, some of them had heavy-handed editors, but it seemed like they were less writing towards again, a certain space on the shelf, a certain page. You know, this is what a novel has to be. Exactly this long. A lot of them were working in the sort of the short story form, which is no longer as popular. Maybe just for pure business reasons. So they were able to get sort of very evocative without having to pad out any of their stories. So you were just like getting right into it. You know, you were like, boom, here's Conan. He's at the entrance of the evil temple. You don't even have to go into like what he was doing 3 days before. You're right into it. And
a lot of the given circumstances of how they had to work made them into good writers, made them cut the fat, you know.
Right. You know, they're getting paid. I mean, Robert D. Howard was big on doing a lot of revisions, as far as I can tell. I mean, people have found various drafts, but you know, they're getting paid by the word, right? And so it was incumbent on them to either write to a certain length, but also give a certain kind of quality and pace and rhythm. I think that, again, what we talked about, there was less hard lines between what's horror, what's fantasy, what's science fiction. So there's a certain freedom of also not being particularly respectable.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, absolutely. Well, at the time, for sure, if you're talking about, you know, Howard, where it's the 30s, so the cultural mores were very different. Right. And you know, just being like, I'm writing for a rag, and I love writing for a pulp. I love writing for the pulps, you know.
Right. And I think the other thing that was pretty clear is right now it's pretty hard, even if you're pretty famous, to just make your living only from writing. And that was what actually Robert E. Howard was doing. I'm not sure how good of a living it was, but that's what he was doing. You know, nowadays there's so many writers, as good as they are, they're teaching at Clarion Workshop. They're doing all these other sort of associated media, which is great. But I think all of that probably also takes time away from your craft to a certain point. To a certain extent, right? If you're constantly going on, like, you know, signing tours and, you know, conferences and stuff like that. You know, you can see these writers developing really rapidly. Like Robert D. Howard wrote all the Conan stories in the space of, less than 3 years?
We like our writers poor, depressed, and living paycheck to paycheck.
Right.
But for me, it's like, you know, this will sound like a tangent, but I promise it's related. My favorite horror movie is a movie called Daughters of Darkness. And Daughters of Darkness is this 1974 Harry Kumel horror film out of Holland that's a co-production between the Netherlands, the United States, Germany, France, and Canada. And like, it stars a dude from Dark Shadows, 2 porn actresses, and it also stars Delphine Seyrig, who's like this great French intellectual actress who was the star of The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie and last year Marion Bad and Donkey Skin, this phenomenal actress. And for me, I'm in love with 70s sexploitation cinema. I'm in love with really campy, schlocky horror, and I'm in love with like genuinely good art cinema. And for me, Daughters of Darkness is like the perfect Venn diagram overlap of those 3 things.
Right.
And I feel like a lot of the Appendix N also has that similar overlap for me. You know, we've got the campy, pulpy, over-the-top, wild, silly stuff, overlapped with, sometimes we have some like really strong literary forces. Like Robert E. Howard's prose is actually really strong and really fantastic. Yeah. We have some really beautiful language in Lord Dunsany. Fritz Leiber, just like, he can like make me laugh. Michael Moorcock has brought me to tears with the final Stormbringer collection.
Yeah.
And then that overlapped with, what's the third one? Just like genuinely good. Yeah. So I don't know. I feel like it kind of encapsulates all of those things. The pacing is fun. It's rapid. You know, the Lord of the Rings really truly is the outlier in the Appendix N, because the Lord of the Rings is really like it's a vast work about good versus evil, and we can spend 60 pages of somebody walking through the woods. But the rest of the Appendix N isn't usually focused on good versus evil. It's
Right.
focused on like somebody who like wants to get rich, loses all their money, and just kind of like is constantly kind of battling that day-to-day living paycheck to paycheck as like a thief slash adventurer.
Right.
And the stories tend to be short. Even when it is a novel, it's usually like 140 pages. Like Hoy says, we start right in on the action. Every page, something new is happening. And they're just electric and fun.
Right. And I think a lot of the fiction of that period is dealing with modernity, whereas a lot of fantasy we're now is postmodern, right? And so that was the conflict of, both looking backwards. Because a lot of these writers were literally, Edgar Rice Burroughs literally was in the Wild West.
Yes.
And lived all the way through World War II and the atomic bomb, right? And if you just talk about these like overlaps of how these people, you could go almost to, I don't know, back to like Melville or Moby Dick or something like that. Probably, I'm not sure. Somewhere in there, right? So thinking about all those things that they had to sort of experience, and sometimes some of it is quite reactionary, like Lovecraft's. Not to mention just straight up racist, but reactionary
Right.
also. But I still would not toss Lovecraft overboard. I could tell you that,
Well,
you have to read it.
that brings me to the next thing I was going to talk to you guys about, because when we talk about the Appendix N, let's face it, when we talk about all of fantasy, all of science fiction, speculative fiction, there's a lot of stuff that is now considered problematic. You mentioned Lovecraft, who I think even at the time he was writing was blatantly racist. And do you guys ever face difficulties? First of all, I want to say you do a fantastic job of talking about these things on your show, of bringing them up when you're discussing the books. But do you ever face difficulties in when you're consuming the book, when you're discussing it with people later, when you're introducing it to people? Like, are people aware of that? And how do you talk about it, or how do you, I guess, reconcile it in your head?
Well, Hoy and I were really determined to be very upfront about how we were approaching this stuff, and we had a conversation about it. And that's why if you listen to episode 0 of the Appendix N, it was really important for us to sit down and say that we recognize there were a lot of very problematic elements to a lot of this fiction. There's a lot of racism, there's a lot of misogyny. Every story here was written by a white person. Almost all of them were written by men. And the ways that women and people of color and queer people are represented are usually very shocking, and definitely don't conform to modern ideals, to our modern kind of moral compass. But Hoy and I went into this with kind of 3 things in mind. The first being, we're not going to tell you not to read these things because of this stuff. We're not going to. The second one is we're not going to apologize for this stuff. But the third thing is we are also always going to talk about it when we do encounter it, because it is important to keep the conversation at the forefront. Because, I'm somebody, it's very important to me that our hobby is something that's safe for people of color, women, LGBTQ people to come to. And I fully recognize that a lot of people who fall into those categories, who read some of this fiction, are going to feel kind of grossed out and uncomfortable while they're reading it.
Yeah.
And, I am, in many regards in my life, pretty fortunate. I'm growing up. You can see me on the stream, I'm Asian. Growing up,
And you can see the stream, I'm a big homo.
Right.
Sure. I was going to mention it, and I was going to say it that way.
Right. But, I was growing up at the tail end of the Vietnam War, and so, there's various tensions there. It was also sort of the time when, the Black Panthers were being, some of them were being assassinated, or, counter-revolution, in the early 70s. And, you kind of just had to, just let it kind of wash over you if you didn't want it to break you, right? And, again, I was pretty sheltered and pretty lucky in some ways, but I think it's to the credit of people now who are saying, no, we shouldn't have to do that. But, the circumstances, and we can see what's going on, in the last, in particular, I don't know, when the show airs, maybe this will still be going on, but, in the last week, in the last 2 weeks, that's just it rising to the surface, so it's been there.
Yeah.
But if you're not, a white male, cishet male, you are always going to have to find ways to see yourself in fiction that doesn't show you, right? And so whatever it is that you latch onto, whether it's the heroism. So, okay, I think why people like a lot of the Hobbits and Lord of the Rings is a lot of people always have a sense of being underdogs, and the Hobbits are the ultimate underdog. So I identify with Frodo or Bilbo or Merry and Pippin, and so you find.
But at the same time, I'm never going to ask a person of color to force themselves to do that. Because if, for example, a black person starts reading some Lovecraft and sees the really despicable way Lovecraft describes black people, they might be genuinely upset by that depiction. And there's no reason, if that's something you don't need or don't want in your life, you don't have to go there.
No, absolutely right. Absolutely right. I'm just saying that in the context of my growing up and reading this fiction, it was just that was what you had to work with. There were other people who were coming around. Charles Saunders, I think, was in the late 70s with the Imaro books, Samuel Delaney.
Right.
It's pretty telling, I think, that a lot of the women writers in the Appendix N, C.L. Moore, Andre Norton, Lee Brackett, they don't, we all know them as women writers now, but they're not obviously signifying by their names or that they're women writers. And we just had a long discussion with one of our recent guests about whether we could even tell that Lee Brackett's fiction was written by women and what we thought were some of the clues there. And there's a lot of things that I don't, we all have sort of blind spots. There's a lot of things that I don't know about. I don't know particularly about transgender issues and, various other, there's tons of issues I don't know about. I'm willing to be educated on.
Sure.
Yeah.
And also, there's something about the Appendix N that is also very specifically getting a bit of a revival in kind of white supremacy circles. And, when we first launched the Appendix N book club, the very first super positive review we encountered was one that was written by somebody who's a well-known white supremacist.
Oh, God.
It also feels important for us to make sure that people understand that that's not where we're coming from, because there are some people who are specifically going to this fiction because they look at it as a respite from the contemporary message fiction and stories written by women and people of color. And I personally really rail against the idea that even the Appendix N, that it wasn't message fiction. You read a lot of this stuff, and a lot of it is very clearly allegory for the social ills of the time. Some of it's not. Like, you read Gardner F. Fox, and Gardner F. Fox is just like having a schlocky, campy good time. But that's also, I have a place in my heart for that as well. But not all the Appendix N is just Gardner F. Fox.
Yeah, and I think you won't meet a bigger liberal voice, I think, than a Michael Moorcock, right? I mean,
right. I mean,
that's
an outright socialist. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Yeah, a lot of it, sometimes it's called new wave fiction, the stuff that was happening in the 60s and 70s, and it adopted the politics of its time. So a lot of it is messagey, I think, in a good way, in a great way.
And Michael Moorcock is absolutely the exception to that old adage, never meet your idols. My God, that man is so incredible.
Yeah. But your interview with him was so lovely. I mean, it was just so great to read someone's work and then have a unfair bias about who you think they probably are. Because I've known a lot of older writers where, not known personally, but, you read their work and then you see them in an interview, a Ray Bradbury or somebody like that, and you're like, okay, yeah, he's got my grandpa's politics. I figured he would, and it's a little disappointing, but I got to get over it. That's the way the world is. And then I hear you guys talk to Michael Moorcock, and you find out he's the guy that wrote Stormbringer, and he is that guy.
And he's infiltrating Nazi meetings, only to find out that everybody else who's at the Nazi meeting is also an infiltrator, except for the old white-haired woman who's serving them cookie and tea.
Tea and cookies, yeah. Right? The only real Nazi there.
Oh, so great. All right. Yeah, I think that's great. As long as you can keep having the discussion about these issues, then I think you're doing a good thing when these issues come up in your reading or whatever.
Right.
So let's get into adapting. You guys always talk about after you've read a book, you go, how would we adapt this to a game? And I want to ask you, what's been your own experience? Have you guys done any of that? Have you adapted literature to your games, and how has that gone, or what did you find the experience to be like?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I'd say that I've never done like today we're gonna do a Harold Shea game, or
Sure.
today we're gonna do. I mean, I guess I've played Call of Cthulhu, so I guess I've done today we're gonna play Lovecraft.
Sure.
But that's different because there's a whole rule set telling you exactly how you can do that. But that said, I steal stuff from literature all the time.
Right.
And that's one of the things that I think is really great about being a voracious consumer of literature and film when you're somebody who either writes adventures or runs games, because you're constantly getting inundated with inspiration. And I highly encourage anybody to like take it. You know, I was watching the first Lone Wolf and Cub movie on Tuesday, and there were a handful of things that happened that I'm like, ooh, I'm going to put that into the old school Essentials game I'm running on Saturday. And sometimes it's really as easy as like if you got a monster that you think is cool and you want to throw it in, but you don't yet feel comfortable enough to write your own monsters from scratch, then just take an existing monster from the monster manual, describe it differently, but use the exact same statistics. And if one thing clearly needs to be changed, change that one thing, but otherwise just run it the way you wanted to run it.
Yeah. That's great. What about you, Hoy? Have you experimented with that at all?
Yeah.
I know when you guys talk about it on the show, you talk about, well, this element would work really well, or this this would make a great weapon, or you deal in specifics, components.
Right.
We're very modular.
Yeah.
I think there's a couple ways to think about it. And I think coming from the old school lens, I mean, Gary Gygax was a magpie, right? He'd see this little shiny bit and he would bring it in. He sees this little shiny bit and he would bring it in. And it becomes its thing. Suddenly it's this nest with all this stuff woven through it. And I think whereas, again, you mentioned like Blades in the Dark, which is very much optimized for doing a heist game, or, and maybe it's like a Tarantino sort of like the Reservoir Dogs Aftermath, right? And these other games where it's very much emulating certain scenes and stuff like that. And to me, that's more difficult because then when you're trying to like completely emulate something from one medium in another medium, that always becomes difficult, right? Because most narrative fiction doesn't have a group protagonist. It's usually a singular protagonist or maybe a partner. So that doesn't really work that well for an open table role-playing situation where you don't know how many players are going to show up, right? It might work for a very focused experience like Cthulhu Confidential, where it's almost one-on-one, right?
Right.
But not so much for, okay, well, or these are the 8 people who came over, we're going to order a pizza, and we're playing D&D, right? So to me, as we've talked about on the show, it's taking this little piece, that little piece, maybe a set piece, a monster, or emulating a mood rather than specifically the actual beats of every single piece of fiction
Right.
in front of us. Because that, I think, is much more... I mean, it's difficult enough to adapt fiction to, a film. Right, that's why we find out that sometimes TV works better because of the structure and the time that is available to us, right?
Right.
For certain narratives. So,
Hi, Kitty.
And they still, and they still fall down on the job, as witnessed the last season of Game of Thrones. But
Sure. Well, there they were adapting something that's not finished. So in a way, they were adapting something that lent itself more to gaming because it was already open-ended.
Right.
And George R.R. Martin was a huge fan of most of the Appendix N authors and had stolen quite a bit from them for his own works.
Absolutely. The Targaryens. Oh, hi. This is Clint, our secret game master and producer. Hi, Clint.
Hey, everybody. I am max hedgering this thing because Jared looked like a potato for too long, and I thought we might try and fix it real quick.
All right.
But now you look better.
I look like a potato?
You were very pixelated on our
dear.
stream.
Yeah.
So you're so handsome. We don't want to ruin it. I thought we would give you a chance to refresh your browser. Maybe I'd ask these guys a question while you did so.
Oh, okay. I'll do that. Here I go.
Hey, Jeff. Hey, Hoy. Pleasure to meet you.
How you doing?
Hi, Clint.
Hey, I'm always hiding in the background of these things like a real creep. I gave Jared one question to give you guys, and I will just ask it because I'm here.
All right.
So,
Shoot.
Shoot.
it is on the subject of game adaptation. Jared's back. I'm going to let him ask my question. Ooh, and he's looking good.
I look good now?
Ooh, you do.
All
I
right.
didn't realize that the potato remark was due to my my computer. I thought you were just like, what's wrong with you today, man? You look bloated. All right. Clint, you want me to ask
Whatever.
your question, right?
I'll leave it to you. You're the performer, my man.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
You can stay, actually.
Nobody wants
Clint did have a great question, which is that he says, on the subject of adapting, there have been a large number of authors and items that were on the original Appendix N that have actually been turned into their own RPGs and supplements. Do you guys have any favorites? And do you appreciate how they succeed or fail as a adaptation of the fiction they're trying to emulate? For example, I have the Modiphius Conan game.
Oh.
Have you tried that out at all?
I have the PDS, but I haven't played it yet, so I definitely need to.
I've not. I did play that most recent Conan board game though, where you got like the different set pieces and you like move the character pieces around.
I love that game.
It's surprisingly fun and surprisingly very flavorful to the original fiction for what's essentially just a board game.
Yeah.
And I think they're using the same rule set for the John Carter game, right? I think for the,
Oh, that I don't
the
know.
Modiphius.
Ooh,
I'm sorry,
cool.
The Modiphius one. Yeah. So,
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But the Dungeon Crawl Classics Lankmar box set is stunning and amazing and so full of flavor. They do lots of really interesting things with that. Like, for example, Fafford and Grey Mouser are always kind of getting out of trouble at the last minute. So Dungeon Crawl Classics did this really kind of great... They already had a luck mechanic, but then they threw in this fleeting luck mechanic where your luck flies away just as fast as it comes in. And it's a very fun little mechanic. But also one thing that I love about Dungeon Crawl Classics Lankmar box set is they have this thing called spell stipulations. And every time a wizard has a new spell, you roll on this table, this percentile table, to see what the thing is you have to do when you cast that spell. So perhaps every time you cast sleep, you have to do it, under the moonlight, or you have to be burning a brazier full of incense, or you have to be naked, or you have to be shouting this spell out at the top of your lungs. So everybody has a different way of doing it, but it brings in kind of that kind of ritual magic vibe that you see so often in the Appendix N, as opposed to just like the pew 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 kind of style of magic.
Right. Adaptations. I mean, we're probably missing a bunch, but I mean, the first Elric one was Stormbringer. That was Ken St. Andre.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sure, yeah.
It had a ton of flavor, but I think it was very hard to play because the Molnabonians were so overpowered compared to any of the regular humans from the New Kingdom.
Sure. One struggles to figure out why a player would want to play someone other than a Melnibodan in a Stormbringer game.
Yeah.
Right. So there was that. I mean, Call of Cthulhu is as close to a perfect game as I can think of. So
yeah,
it's incredibly successful. Although it maybe more is a August Derleth game than a Howard H.P. Lovecraft.
Fair.
Depends on who's running it, right?
Right.
Mine is a bit August Derleth, I'll be honest, because I found that I played some really hardcore Cthulhu games that I thought captured Lovecraft's sort of philosophy and worldview. And the players after 6 or 7 sessions were kind of like, what, we're dead again? Like, we're insane again? Like, players do like to win sometimes.
Right.
Yeah.
And I haven't played like the Amber dice list. I know that
I haven't
out
either.
there. And so there's still a lot. And I think
And there's the Witch World Gurps supplement.
Absolutely, yeah.
And what's his face? Robin what?
Robin D. Laws.
Robin Laws wrote the Gaian Reach.
Right, the Jack Vance game.
Yeah.
I think there's a
the
new
Dying
Jack
Earth
Vance game coming out.
Well, DCC is putting out a new Dying Earth.
Oh, good.
And-
Okay, yeah,
And there's
excellent.
a Lioness, which is based on Mithras, which is RuneQuest. So there's a Lioness setting, which is post-Appendix N. But but yeah, it's hard to say because the danger always with a adaptation of a specific work is you've optimized it for that, but that also means that you've also sort of boxed yourself in. That's why I don't really like playing the Star Wars games, because at the end of the day, unless you just take it completely away from the whole sort of Empire storyline, at the end of the day, you know that you're just affecting stuff around the edges because it's still the story of the Skywalkers, right? And so you don't really you don't really get to do much.
When the Game of Thrones role-playing game came out, I had my friend, and he was like begging me to run in it, and I was like, I'll run it, but we've got to be in like the far end of Dorne, doing stuff that has nothing to do with the main plot of Game of Thrones. And that was a deal breaker. And then I was like, okay, well then I'm not running it, because I don't want to be like, and then the Hound walks in. There's something about that
it's very schlocky.
It's schlocky, and it feels difficult to manage, frankly, because players already have a lot of tools in their toolbox. I don't need to give them in-canon continuity as well.
So
you got to keep players in their place,
And one of those, for example, the downsides of Gurps, again, I think it's an incredible system, and they've had so many books that have been, they had a Conan book for a while, and they've had all these other properties that they've licensed. But the downside is that you still feel the Gurps peeking through.
Right.
And so you can't sort of immerse yourself into the
Yeah.
experience fully. So this is a trade-off between having something that's very specifically designed to emulate a piece of fiction versus something that is a more general tool set, is that, in that case, the seams start to show a little bit, right?
Yeah.
But also one of the beauties of the Appendix N is the idea of the multiverse and unlimited dimensions is something that comes up again and again and again in the Appendix N. So in that sense, maybe Gurps is a perfect fit.
Oh, hi, Clint's back. Do I look like a potato again?
You look great. Somebody said Gurps, and I was summoned.
Oh, right. Clint is a huge Gurp
Candyman.
stan.
I'm only going to say, great answer to the question, guys. I will vouch for the Amber Diceless system. And Jared, these guys can badmouth Gurps, but we don't badmouth Gurps in this family.
Okay, sorry. I wasn't about to badmouth Gurps. I would say that it doesn't feel like the Conan stories are written with Gurps rules in mind.
And Clint, I actually have from Man to Man going forward, so I have actually all that stuff up to
Thank you.
No, we like Gurps around here. We don't like running it, but we like it. Running it can be a bit tough. Okay, well then, I guess my final two. I just have a couple more questions here for you guys. Do you think there's anything that makes, and maybe we've already answered this, but do you think anything makes a story ripe for adaptation or borrowing to a game? Is there anything that where you can go, oh, I know this will work because, I know this will work in my game because, how do you identify those things?
Well, I'd say items and characters and locations are all very easy to port. But if you're talking about story elements, I think the big place to be careful with wanting to import story elements is you don't want to be forcing your characters in a specific direction. The whole railroad thing. So I once heard somebody say that when you're writing an adventure, the best thing to do is to keep in mind what the things that would happen if the characters didn't intervene. And so I feel like if you're specifically taking some kind of a villain's plot, if you're taking it from the perspective of what would have happened if the heroes in the story hadn't intervened, and then bringing that into your game, go for it. But if you're looking to have the exact same, Gollum bites off the ring, the ring finger in the middle of Mountain Doom, you're nobody's going to be satisfied with that.
Right.
That's great to keep in mind, and that's part of Encounter Theory and some other books I've read on GMing, is that the story, what is the story if the characters don't intervene? What the antagonists have a life of their own, right? They are going to go ahead with their agenda, and that's really helpful, I think, for a game master.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that you should really be looking at short stories rather than novels if you wanted to adapt to the game, because again, the short story form is much more like a module than, or even 2 or 3 sessions of adventure than a full novel, because then you have all those. With most novels, you have so much interior monologue. You have, it's not necessarily pure 3-act structure like a screenplay or a short story. So I think short stories sort of get to the meat of the meat of what's going on a little bit more quickly, and that lends itself better to a gaming situation at the table, at least when you have a finite amount of time, usually no more than 4 to 6 hours, right? And that's being generous in this day and age.
Right. Yeah, I think I heard probably maybe Kenneth Haidt or Robin Laws one time say that, especially if you're when you're running a game, but especially if you're running like a tournament game or something like that, the game should start as late as possible in the storyline, right?
Right.
That's probably true of just writing in general. You should start at like the most interesting, latest point in the story that it can.
Right. And so even in Tolkien, it's deceptive, but right, he could have started the story in the first age, right? At least in the Lord of the Rings. But
Sure. Well,
it
he
seems
kind
like
of
it's all-
does. He makes
Right.
sure he writes that
you know.
whole history too.
Right, he writes it there, but I think it was for his own benefit.
Even
but-
the Lord of the Rings, it's like that was handed to me before the Hobbit, and you're kind of like, what happened?
Right, right,
How did he get this ring?
right.
Yeah, Tolkien's like the king of like prologue.
Right. But certainly like Moorcock, Howard, all those people, you're already well into the situation. And,
Yeah.
And that's definitely the way, like, for example, the DCC modules are written, or at least the ones that are official from Goodman Games. Well, I shouldn't even say official. The ones that are published by Goodman Games. Because Goodman Games and DCC has been really, really great about embracing third party, the DIY, the self-publishers, much more so than, you know, TSR was in the past, or Wizards of the Coast was until very recently. And again, so they've managed to bring that under the umbrella of this sort of, you know, official product, but there's all these people writing stuff, and then, you know, they even will be showcasing, you know, these third-party products on their own, you know, website and in their own store. So I think they've been really great about that, you know.
Yeah.
So props. to
Yeah,
them.
I really love how Goodman Games, their modules usually start the way old school Dungeons and Dragons modules started. You're standing outside the dungeon.
Right.
And there was so much of my early game mastering where I was like, how do these characters get together? Why would they work together? Do their mothers know each other? We should probably have a scene with their mothers. And it's like, you can just start people outside the dungeon and they'll figure it out. The players will tell you.
Yeah, I was gonna say you can make it the player's problem. Like I'm starting a new Old School Essentials campaign starting tomorrow, and I'm not gonna figure out why these characters want to adventure together. That's their problem.
Right.
They're
And
gonna
it'll
figure
probably
that out,
be
and they're gonna
really
let me
interesting
know.
and fun
Right.
to
I'm
hear.
definitely not reading any player's backstory. You know, you can tell me if it's like in 2 or 3
Yeah.
sentences, but, you know, don't tell me your character's backstory. Having
Yeah.
said that, one of the games I'm playing, I'm running Old School Essentials as well for the Yunsuin setting, which is basically a whole 300-page book of generators, random
Yeah.
generators, and about the sort of very exotic, faintly Asian setting. And so one of the things you can do is just like kind of have everybody roll their social connections, and then sort of just talk about like, well, how does this fit together? Like, oh, so you are somehow associated with an opium den. There's a rivalry involved, and then people start coming up with these ideas. Like, I had a brand new player who just came in. I don't think he's ever played maybe just one game of D&D. They've only played one game of D&D, and they said, "Oh, I'm associated with this Crabman sort of box gym. You know, they're Crabman gladiators, and I think I stole the egg for like the next Crabman champion, and that's why they're after me." Right? I said, okay,
Yeah.
great. And so I have a pet monkey, so I've got a ribbon, and I've tied the egg around the pet monkey's neck. Right? I said, okay,
Love
great.
it.
I
And that's
really
one of
wanna-
the reasons why, like, my favorite people to play with are people who've either never played before or have played very little, because I feel like people who've played a lot, especially if they've played a lot of a specific kind of RPG, have learned to say no to their creativity in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
They've had years of DMs saying, nope, you can't do that. Nope, you don't have the right feat for that. You don't have the right skill for that. You don't have the right spell for that. Rather than this this environment of like saying yes to your players and like encouraging that creativity.
Yeah, and you know, I played with kids a lot. I ran Dungeons and Dragons for kids, and they are so much more fun to play with than adults. And I love playing with adults. I play with adults in all of my games, but adults sometimes try to do what they think you want them to do, and kids don't know what they don't know what they're doing. So they do what they want to do, and it's really kind of fun and surprising and exciting. There was a character in one of the games named, it was a ranger named Chicken, and he liked to cut the feet off of chickens. I will never forget it. It was odd, and it ended up mattering in the game, and it was really strange. I think we have come to the end. I just have one last question for you guys. Is there a book, maybe each of you have one of these, not in the sci-fi fantasy horror realm, that means a lot to you? And then I have a follow-up question after you tell me what that book is. So, just a favorite book that doesn't happen to be speculative fiction.
Either maybe Grapes of Wrath or the first 49 stories by Ernest Hemingway.
Okay, Grapes of Wrath, or what was the other one?
The first 49 stories by Ernest Hemingway.
Oh, right on. Okay, excellent. I'm a giant Steinbeck fan. I just read Cannery Row and Tortilla Flat. Have you read those?
I have not. I do need to.
They're his comedies. They're really funny.
Yeah, and then I'm a big fan of crime and noir.
Yeah.
And fiction as well. So.
My follow-up question then, Hoy, is you said Grapes of Wrath. What would that look like as a DCC campaign?
DCC? Oh well.
That actually would lend itself pretty well, I think.
I think Tom Joad is a hero.
Yeah.
And what was his brother's name? The one who was sort of wanders off, and then Ma Joad is like a 10th level something. I don't know. Ma Joad's a cleric.
They're a party. The Joad family is a party.
Yeah. Ma Joad is definitely like a 5th level, 10th level cleric with 17 personality in DCC terms.
What about you, Jeff? Do you have a favorite book, and what would it look like as a DCC campaign?
Well, I'm not sure how this one would translate, but probably Just Kids by Patti Smith.
Wow. Yeah, that would be, let's see, that's a rock memoir.
Yes,
a New York memoir, right?
Yeah, it's more of a New York memoir. It's, Patti Smith talking about when she lived with Robert Mapplethorpe in the Chelsea Hotel in the 1970s. So, I mean, I guess you could have kind of a gritty New York 1970s art punk scene DCC game.
I think it needs its own rule set, is what I think. I think that's maybe a new role-playing game.
I do dig it, and I like, which kind of Chelsea girl are you, kind of random table.
Right.
And then there'd be lots of hallucinogenic drug effect tables.
I love it. I'd play.
I'd want to be able to. A 70s RPG game though, just everything that was happening in New York in the 70s. If you could bring in the 70s hip hop, early 70s hip hop players, and
right.
I'm gonna play the entire Ramones. That's my
Your character is the Ramones.
The Ramones.
Yeah, and you could be like, the Weather Underground just bombed the Chrysler Building. That would be really fun, actually.
Right.
You guys, thank you so much for coming on here and chatting with me. Jeff, Goad, and Hoy, their podcast is called the Appendix N Book Club Podcast. You can find it on any podcatcher thing, any pod network player will play the Appendix N Book Club Podcast. Listen to it, and get some book recommendations at the very least, because a lot of this stuff is so worth your time. Right. Guys, I hope you'll come on and maybe play a game with us next time, or come hang out with us again sometime.
We would love that. Or I would love that. Would you love that, Hoy?
I would definitely love that.
Okay, good. It's a consensus. Thank you guys so much. And we'll talk to you again soon. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Have a great evening, Jared.
Cheers.